A highly successful team leader, Thomas Benson, stands before his clients during a high-stakes business pitch. Then, he freezes. His eyes dart around the room, and he collapses straight to the floor. This is the inciting incident of Sticks and Stones, and it sets off a chain reaction that systematically destroys a man's career. Following the collapse, Thomas experiences a series of hyper-specific accidents. Crucial emails mysteriously fail to send. Long-standing client relationships are quietly intercepted by colleagues, and through it all, his team smiles, offering hollow sympathy while systematically undermining his every move. The psychological toll mounts rapidly. Thomas stops sleeping. He begins to second-guess his own memory, descending into deep anxiety and paranoia. He finds himself trapped in a terrifying loop, endlessly wondering if the sabotage is a coordinated attack, or if he is simply losing his mind. This is a psychological death by 1,000 cuts. It leaves the victim broken, yet with no visible scars to prove a crime ever took place. While Thomas Benson is a fictional character, the series highlights a documented pattern of workplace behavior that employment experts describe as an invisible epidemic. It thrives in the everyday interactions of corporate life, frequently going unreported. The problem is that corporate systems are often unequipped to track it. You can't quantify a cold shoulder or a sarcastic tone on a spreadsheet. Human resources departments have no metrics to measure the frequency of perfectly timed eye rolls during a presentation. This creates a terrifying investigative problem. If the harassment is invisible to HR and leaves zero physical evidence behind, how can a victim actually prove they are under attack? They often can't. The ambiguity of the behavior is the weapon itself. Because bullies operate in a complete vacuum of proof, victims are forced to fight an enemy that, according to the official company record, does not exist. The creator of Sticks and Stones, writer Mike Bartlett, drew direct inspiration for the series from an earlier play of his called Bull. He became fascinated by the concept of modern office goading, a sanitized, corporate version of gladiatorial combat where colleagues bait each other into making mistakes. To understand how this goading thrives, look at this visual spectrum demonstrating the blurry, overlapping boundary between legitimate, constructive criticism on one side and targeted psychological harassment on the other. In competitive environments, these behaviors look nearly identical to an outside observer. Aggressors exploit this exact gray area. When called out for malicious behavior, they simply shift their actions towards the constructive side of the spectrum, defensively labeling their torment as harmless office banter. This trap is especially effective when combined with the expectations of toxic masculinity. Men in highly competitive roles are culturally conditioned to man up and project invulnerability. Admitting to an emotional breakdown is viewed as a fatal weakness, forcing the victim to absorb the abuse in silence. By framing cruelty as banter and demanding victims man up, office cultures create a powerful smokescreen. They effectively disguise systematic psychological abuse as a standard expected cost of doing business. If a victim decides to look for legal protection, they hit a brick wall. In the United Kingdom, there is actually no specific statutory definition of workplace bullying written into law. Instead, courts rely on working frameworks. This structured breakdown of the ACAS guidelines highlights the 3 core criteria used to evaluate complaints. The behavior must make a victim feel intimidated, degraded, or humiliated. But even with those criteria, there is a massive legal loophole. For an employee to have strong statutory protection against harassment, the abuse must be directly tied to a legally protected characteristic, like race, gender, or disability. If the bully is just tormenting someone for the sake of it, the case falls apart. Because the law requires these rigid parameters, victims of generalized psychological torment are left entirely stranded. They are caught in a legal void where their suffering is real, but legally unrecognizable. We see this exact dynamic play out in the climax of Sticks and Stones, when Thomas finally gathers the courage to formally confront his boss, Carter, about the coordinated abuse. Carter reacts with immediate skepticism. He listens to the complaints, but calmly points out that every single example Thomas provides, a missed email, a misplaced file, an awkward meeting, sounds entirely innocent out of context. The bullies have built perfect, plausible deniability, and this plausible deniability springs the ultimate trap. When a victim attempts to report highly subjective, invisible abuse, The very act of complaining makes them appear paranoid, irrational, or unstable to management. This creates a systemic disadvantage. When proof relies on the perception of subtle, deniable actions, the institutional preference for objective evidence often leaves the aggressor untouched. But there is a real-world legal mechanism to solve this crisis, and it requires shifting the burden of responsibility away from the victim and placing it directly onto the company. This diagram visualizes the employer liability umbrella established by the Equality Act of 2010 and the Health and Safety at Work Act of 1974. Together, these laws create an absolute implied duty for an employer to provide a safe working environment and shield their workers from hostile elements. To avoid liability under this umbrella, a company must legally implement reasonable steps. This means they cannot wait for a victim to build a perfect case. They must proactively enforce clear anti-bullying policies and establish immediate, structured grievance redress protocols. Office banter is no longer a valid legal shield. When a worker's psychological well-being is destroyed by their colleagues, it is a systemic corporate failure, and employers are legally mandated to eradicate it.